In the last section, we tried refreshing our application and we got a message that said window is not defined. In this section, we're going to talk about this error message and we're going to figure out why it's being thrown and how to fix it. This really cuts to the core of what Next.js is doing for us. So like I said in the last video, it's actually serving as a very nice segue into an important topic. So let's talk about what's going on. We're not going to directly discuss that error just yet. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of background information on Next, and then it'll be a lot more clear why we're seeing that error. Okay, so here's the background information you need to know. When we were previously working on our lottery project, we had made use of create React app, right? Here's create React app over here. We wrote some amount of React code and we created a contract or two, and then eventually we got all that content to show up inside the browser. One thing I want to make sure is really clear is that when we were using create React app, that server or that process that we were running inside of our terminal took all of the React code that you and I wrote and then served it up into our browser. So all create React app did for us was take all the JavaScript code that we wrote and made it available to the browser. Our browser downloaded all that code as the React app. It then executed that code. Our React application boot up, and it displayed some amount of content on the screen. The key there is that the create React app server, its entire purpose was just to serve up some JavaScript code, and it had no idea what it was really doing or what it was serving. It just knew, hey, here's some JavaScript files, take it if you want it. So in practice, the create React app server was kind of simplistic, not a lot of complexity there. As you might guess, the situation with Next.js is a little bit more confusing. So let's talk about what's going on there. Next.js makes use of a process called server-side rendering. The idea of server-side rendering is that whenever someone accesses our Next.js server, the server is going to take our React application, and rather than just send all that JavaScript down to the browser, Next is going to try to render the entire React app itself. In other words, all of our JavaScript code is being executed on the Next server. That server builds up an HTML document, and then it takes that HTML document and it sends it down to the browser. The benefit to this approach is that our users end up seeing content on the screen much more quickly than when we were using create React app. Just think about it. With this approach over here, this server had to take all that JavaScript, send it on down. We had to download that JavaScript. We had to parse it inside the browser. We're not doing that manually, but the browser is. The React app had to boot up and then render some content on the screen. And that all takes some amount of time to execute. If the React app was very large, like maybe 1 or 2 megabytes of JavaScript, that entire process could take potentially several seconds, especially if our users were on a poor mobile connection. However, with this server-side rendering approach, because the Next server is sending down a completely rendered HTML document, our content is going to appear on our user screen much more quickly, especially if our users are on a mobile device. So by using Next and using this idea of server-side rendering, we are ending up with an application that is much more flexible for a wide variety of customers or users in the world today who might be accessing our product off a mobile device with a poor cellular connection. Just so you know, after the Next server sends down our HTML document to be rendered on the screen, it does shortly later send down all of our JavaScript code as well. After this JavaScript code is loaded up into the browser, the React app inside this code right here, this is our code base, then boots up and takes over inside the browser. So eventually the React app is booted up inside the browser, but the whole idea here is that before any of that occurs, we very quickly show some plain HTML content on the screen, just to get something on the screen earlier for our users. So you might be wondering, well, how does this all relate to the error message that we just saw? The error message that says, window is not defined. Well, let's think about it for a second. We just said a moment ago, our code gets executed on the Next server. I want to go pull up one file that we wrote inside of our project so far, and I'm going to point out something inside of it. So back inside my code editor, I'm going to pull open the web3.js file. Inside of here, you'll recall that we took a look at this window variable. Window is a global variable that is available only inside the browser. Window is not available on Node.js, which is where our server is currently running. So in other words, whenever Next.js loads up our code in an attempt to render our React application on the server, that window variable is not defined. So we get that error message that says, hey, you're trying to access window, and that variable is not defined. And that's why we saw this big, nasty error message. It's because whenever the Next server is attempting to render our application, we don't have access to that variable. Like I said, this is a really good segue, and it's a really good alert, because now we know that whenever we are writing one of our React components or some snippet of Ethereum code or whatever it might be, we need to be aware, or at least thinking about whether or not that code is going to be executed on the Next server. Because if it is, that means that we cannot just freely assume that we have access to some objects or variables or whatever else that are usually defined inside the browser. So in short, long story short here, I know we've been talking about this for a while, the long story, the short story, whatever, is that we cannot directly access this window variable inside of this web3.js file. So we'll figure out a workaround to that in just a second. But before we do, there's one last thing that I want to mention about this entire server-side rendering process. You might be thinking, Steven, geez, this server-side rendering stuff, where did this come from, right? Again, it goes back to the same thing we said earlier. You're here to learn about Ethereum, not React. Well, here's the thing. When we start thinking about Ethereum, we've been saying all along that we really expect our users to be running MetaMask inside their browser, right? We've been saying, oh yeah, we're going to use the provider that is given to us by MetaMask, and all is going to be well. But in reality, things usually end up not being quite so easy, right? Chances are essentially nobody in the world is running MetaMask at all inside their browser right now. Maybe at some day in the future, it'll be much more popular, but certainly right now, I really bet you like 99.9% of people out there are not making use of MetaMask. And that means we need to think about how we can make our application work for all those people who are not making use of MetaMask. So the big idea behind using Next.js is this. When our code is taken and rendered on the Next server, we are going to reach out to the Ethereum network and do some initial calls. We're going to do some data fetching. We're going to try to get a list of our campaigns. We're going to find out details about each of those campaigns. We're going to load up how many votes, how many requests, all that kind of stuff. We're going to execute all of those requests from our server. And that means when we produce our HTML document right here to send down to the user's browser, it doesn't matter whether or not our users are using MetaMask. It doesn't matter whether or not they even have access to an Ethereum network, because we have already taken care of all that data fetching for them. And we are going to send them an HTML document with all that information already contained inside of it. So if our code ends up going crazy and saying, hey, MetaMask isn't here, I have no idea what to do, it doesn't matter one bit, because we already wrote all of that data fetching logic to be executed on the server. So all of our users out there who are not using MetaMask are going to very easily see some information on the screen. And as far as they are aware, they don't even know that MetaMask or Ethereum or Brinkby or whatever exist. They don't have to care one bit. So again, like I said, I know this React stuff and the Next.js stuff is a little bit annoying, probably unexpected in this course. However, really good reason that we're using it right here. This is why we are using it, because we cannot assume that our users are making use of MetaMask. Okay, so hopefully that answers a couple of questions. Let's continue in the next video, and we're going to get this window variable right here working whenever our code is executed on the server. So quick break, and we'll take care of that in just a minute.